So in my intro, as I work off the farm as well as a full-time agronomist for a company called Hawkins out of Minneapolis. And my duties with Hawkins is to set up fertilizer distributorships on high-quality starter fertilizers and surfactants and water treatment to any kind of water, from wastewater to well water to irrigation water to processing water. We have the products to help make those waters better and make them usable. Fertilizers are all food-grade acids, so this fertilizer we make are the same acids that you are using to drink in your pop or eat in the pepper sticks we had today, to cosmetics, to other things. So zero heavy metals in these type of products as well too. So very friendly to use. Like I said, grew up in the Crookston area, born and raised in the Crookston area. Started farming in 2004. My dad had the farm and rented it out in 1980 when I went to school, NDSU, and got my degree out of NDSU, and then worked as I was going to school, crop consulting and things like that, and then was able to go off and was working selling equipment, strip till equipment, and then fertilizers and other things like that, and I was able to come back to the farm, take the farm over again. And so it's a cash rental agreement with my brothers, and I own half the acres as well too. So the forefront of moving to the regenerative process came in twofold reasons. I had a friend of mine that came out and drove across my land and said, "My God, how do you farm this kind of land? It is horrible land. What are you doing with this kind of stuff?" The other thing is my land started changing color. It was starting to go from the really nice, rich black to gray. And it was hard to keep water on the field. And it was hard, didn't matter what I did as far as fertility, yields weren't improving. They were just kind of going stagnant to down. Then in that time period, we went through an 11-year drought where the Sahara Desert actually had received more rainfall than what we did in those 11 years. So we raised half of the years a crop was strictly on dew. So that's why I started having to kind of adopt some of the practices like they do out in Montana in the wheat basket out there. We're leaving high residues, tall residues to capture snow. So I had to start beginning harvesting snow, which is kind of a foreign attitude and practice that people don't do, but that was my only moisture. It was to harvest snow and create a blanket thick enough to prevent frost from going in the ground so deep, so that when it would melt, I would actually suck it up and build a reserve there for a small period of time, and then get the crop going, and then hopefully get a rain. So that's a little bit of the background, but here's a picture, and I tease people that that's what my fields look like when I took them over as farming. But this is actually an area out in Idaho. It's Craters of the Moon. So if you've ever been out there, it's something to see. But that's all lava flows. So it's a really interesting backdrop. So here's kind of a quote I found that I thought was pretty interesting. Talent might make you good, but it's your attitude and work ethic that will make you great. So it's just like any other program. When you're coming off of conventional tillage and you're going to a regenerative system or an organic system, if you don't come in with the right attitude, it'll never work for you. If you come in with the attitude of, I'm going to try it, and if I don't like it, I'm going back to my old way, it'll fail 100% of the time. So bring in your good attitude with it, work with it as best as you can with the tools you have, and it'll more than likely work for you. So some of the things I wanted to go over are some soil erosion and soil samples that I've started implementing, some cover crops and harvesting equipment systems, planting equipment, testing labs and professional articles and magazines that I've used, and then I don't think I'll have time for the video from Australia, but we'll see. So today, I always like to say, well, here's a good example of the wind chimes that we use up north, instead of these little dingly ones that came from your porch. This is what today is. Up at home, our winds today are 44 to 54 miles an hour today. We had a half inch of snow, we had a ground blizzard going on. It's kind of moving to the southeast towards this kind of a direction a little bit, but that's what we call as wind chimes. So here's an example of my area up there. We're as flat as these tabletops are. So any type of a breeze will start soil moving up there. And our soils are mostly all clays, very little sands, but except for our beach ridges, because we're at the bottom of Lake Agassiz, ancient bed Lake Agassiz. So this is not uncommon now that we see every spring are these kind of blowing conditions. So the wheat is up, it's 3-4 inches tall. Our seeding space is 7.5 inch seeding spacing, but look at the soil that's starting to move. And these are only 20-mile-an-hour breezes. Those are light breezes at 20 miles an hour. So, but look at the topsoil that's moving in these kind of ditches that'll be filling in. We've had instances where it's blown like that for 3-4 days, and those ditches will go from the edge of that field all the way up to the edge of the gravel road. They'll be 3 feet deep of topsoil that's blowing in there. And what you see in a ditch is only 10%. 90% is gone. 10% is what you see. Some more examples of the dust storms. And in here, in this picture here, you can see a little bit of a green growing crop that's in there. That's what we do for our sugar beets. We'll put a cover crop in there to help protect those little beets from emerging so they don't spin off, because at 4-leaf stage, they start to helicopter and they'll spin, and they'll just spin themselves right out of the ground. The other thing that happens is we start building static electricity. And from all them soil particles colliding, will form static electricity, and you'll see those little beets will actually be electrocuted. They'll be black from electrocution from static electricity.
So you hook that up to a generator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and produce some electricity. Yeah, the windmills up there, our brakes are locked down on the windmills.
So is it the soil particles that are creating the static electricity somehow?
Yeah, the clay particles, and they're colliding and creating so much friction. At the same time, our dew points are down in the 20s and our humidities are down in the teens. So we become extremely dry. So those lead to those kind of events.
Electricity from the soil without letting it blow away.
Exactly, unfortunately. Yep. So those kind of hazy days aren't real effective on solar panels either. So. Okay. So here's some of the severe events actually after the erosion is hit. So this is a soybean field that was planted. They worked the field about 2.5 inches deep, put in their pre-plant herbicides. Wind event came up and it blew that 2 inches of topsoil completely off those fields. And it's right down to the emergence layers. And you can see that's the hard pan where the cultivator shovels went to that depth, and it was just gone. So you can see the soil that's in my hand, how granulated it is. Now when that hits our ditches and we get a 4-inch rain, it plugs everything up. It's a mud pack, water can't flow, can't get off. So then we turn into lakes, real shallow lakes real fast. But that's where all your nutrient levels are at too. But when that soil blows into another field, it seals another field though. Now you've made a seal, it's just like a Tupperware lid. And somebody that's trying to do something on the corrective processes, that's in there and it seals their surface. So it doubly compounds the problem. But in those are all the resistant weed seeds as well too, the Palmer amaranth, the lamb's quarters, the pigweeds, the kochias, everything that everybody's having a tough time controlling. Now eventually that's going to lead into lawsuits because your field might have been clean, now you got resistance weeds that brew from your neighbors. Now you've got a problem on that field, your value of your land, equity value in your land, and your productivity index has now taken a downturn. That leads to lawsuits, leads to bad neighbors.
Not a shelter belt anywhere in sight.
Very few of them, and what was there are torn out and gone because everybody wants to run 50 and 60 foot wide cultivators and 400 and 900 horsepower tractors because they got to be done with that quarter in 2 hours because they got 20,000 more to go. So here's an instance of that previous field that blew. Look at the soil that's in that field. And here there's a farmer up on the north end of it trying to blow it back into his field. So he caught the right wind to blow it back into the field, just to have it blow back the other day again. So once it starts, it just moves forever. So this is a picture I took this fall. I was heading into town. And I'll be politically correct here. This is a tax-funded organization that's farming this land. And they get their equipment for the use of the equipment for free. And so they get the biggest, baddest piece of equipment in this field that was a wheat field, perfect condition to go into the winter. Lots of residue there to stop and harvest snow and everything that's positive. And what were they doing? Tilling it for just because. The labor was there, the tractor was free, the fuel was tax subsidized, everything about it, so we got to make it black. And unfortunately, this was a entity that we had put on the Highway 75 Soil Health Corridor tour at their facility. So the deans and their employees and everybody else were there, attended the day. They saw the slump test, the slake test, they saw the evaporation trials, they saw everything and just ignored it and went back to their same old farming practices.
This was this fall?
Yeah. So we gave them the presentation in June, and this is this fall. So how do we use our research entities that are supposed to be researching and teaching us when they won't implement the practices that they're trying to tell us to do? It makes it really hard to take them as credible resources. So, but this was devastating to see, and I was livid, so I actually called Mark Gutierrez, and I had to vent to somebody, and I told Mark about it, and sent him the videos, and he actually had a meeting the next day with the dean of the Minnesota Department of Ag, so to discuss these kind of practices, and put them on forewarning that they are being watched. So here's something that a lot of people don't talk about, is I call it snow erosion. Like I said, I harvest snow. So I want to see blankets of snow, and I want to see them stay put. Snow is one of Mother Nature's best sandblasters that you can have. It'll destroy anything that you put out there. If you ever look at a snowflake under a microscope, it's extremely ragged and jagged and torn, sharp edges. So it can tear at anything that's out there. So that's why it makes a fantastic job of tearing soil loose. So in these fields, this was a mile-long field going to the north. This was actually during a snowstorm that I was out driving around taking pictures of it. So this field was a full-fledged tight wheat field. Stubble was cut fairly tall, but it was strip-tilled. So all the strips were starting to catch snow. This end of the ditch is clean as far as snow and it goes. And this is a very deep county ditch. And then further to the north, I had a field of oat stubble. And I cut the oat stubble so it was extremely long. So we had clear sailing. Our visibility was clear. So for people to be on roads, it was safe. Our ditches weren't filling up. Our township roads weren't needing to be snowplowed in those kind of conditions. So we saved a tremendous amount of money for taxpayers in this kind of a condition. Here's the other side of that county road. Worked black, very smooth, very flat, as you can see, and it just sails. And so that snow will blow all the way down until it hits the river and then fills up the river bottom areas. It doesn't stay on the ground. It builds very, very deep frost. The only thing is in the spring, it dries fast because the surface, there's no moisture there. So it dries fast so they can hit it and plant it really fast, really early. Again, some more pictures of snow erosion. So on the other side of this picture, that you can't see, is my field. That's all in high stubble. So I've captured that snow. I broke that snow, and I got tree rows in mine. So I'm building the snow. And snow on a wheat stubble field, they say, what is it, about twice the height of the growing is the distance that snow will fall. Once it broke my field, hit my neighbor's field, it was off to the races again. So he captured no moisture that we needed. And this was last winter when we were extremely dry. We were extremely dry this spring until we started getting into rain, but that's a whole nother story. But you can already see the discoloration of the snow, the dirt that's in there. And so when you see soil starting to move, 1 ton of soil is barely the thickness of a piece of paper. You never notice it, you never see it. So when we came in on Monday night into the hotel lobby, we were walking in and a janitor had to come out, start mopping up the floor. It wasn't clean water from clean snow, it was muddy water from muddy snow that was tracked in. We're seeing that more and more all the time, that we don't notice, but all these fields that are exposed are blowing and they're tracking it in everywhere. So again, another expense for another employee, for another cause. Those are the minutia of things though. So keep the fields covered if possible. Stop this. So here's last winter. Here's some of the cover in my fields. So we see even with the tree rows, you can see the snowbanks that I've got there. And this tree row to this is only about 300 feet apart. And that's an edge of some wheat stubble. Look at just by stopping that little bit of snow with a short cover of straw, look at the amount of snow I captured there. That's all moisture. But look what it did where I had a plot from the University of Minnesota that they tilled. That's all bare and dry. No snow, no moisture, deep frost. That also leads to early weed season as well too, because as soon as that warms up, those small seeded broadleaf weeds are instantly growing. Now you got a challenge on your hand right away too. The other thing about a tall stubble, they're heat rods. If you can see around, every one of them's got a pocket where it's conducted the heat, brought it down, and starting to melt out. Well, that goes right on down into your soil surface as well. So your root system that's still there, that's not all tilled up and gone, is transferring heat down into the ground, preventing frost depth as well too. But that also keeps soil moving. And if you've got a living root in there, that's transferring heat down into the ground for that living root to keep surviving, keep pumping exudates into the ground as well too, keeping that life moving. Here's soil erosion. So up on my land, we're a very heavy clay soil. These are freshly planted soybeans, and then we got an extensive rain, very fast rain, 3 inches of rain in less than an hour. So those clay particles move really easy. So as you can see, the beans haven't even emerged yet, but look at the root system that's there. So when we talk about cover crops, and everybody goes, wow, I want this cover crop that's 5 feet tall, massive and everything else, and it's getting late in the fall and I don't want to plant the cover crop because I'm not going to get any residue. Well, we're not necessarily looking at residue. It's the root systems that rebuild these soils. Look how fast we can rebuild these soils with these kind of root systems when that plant isn't even above the ground. So don't look at a cover crop saying, well, I don't want to spend that $5 an acre in the fall for a cover because it won't give me any benefit. The benefit is there. So here's water erosion. So in that flat land, our culverts, our ditches are plugged with snow because they blew all off the field and they're 5 and 6 feet deep of snow. That iceberg's got to take a long time to melt out and move out. All of our water flows up into Lake Winnipeg yet besides. So to try to break the snow up into another frozen area is hard to get rid of water. So it's going to sit for a long period of time till those culverts dry and open. But as you can see, this field still was a field of soybean cover. But because of the history of that field being constantly worked and extensively worked, the soil particles floated up in that water. And then finally when that ditch opened up, look at all the sediment that washed in off of that flat field and just filled his ditch in now. But look at the wash that came out of that field, went into the county ditch on my side and left a dirt bank that was over 4 feet deep and over 25 feet long that plugged that county ditch. And I had just cleaned that county ditch 2 years ago, and now there's 2 to 3 feet of topsoil between wind erosion and water erosion that has plugged that half mile of ditch. So here's a ditch that was just cleaned this fall. And you can see the depth of that ditch. The backhoe that was out there had a bucket that was 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep to clean that ditch, and a long arm, extension arm to clean that ditch. And most of that was all soil that was deposited in the last 3 years. They had to be cleaned out. Look at the dollar loss that those farmers took of lost nutrients that were just blowing away.
They had to have it paid, have it get out too.
Yep, all assessed to our taxes. Yep. So here, if this would have been on video, this would have been really interesting to see. These two top fields are a field of one of my neighbors. In the spring, that water the top water was brown, very heavy, thick chocolate brown color, about the color of the door. The water had so many suspended solids in it, it was flowing basically like half-frozen chocolate pudding because it was so thick with suspended solids. And that moves down across, and here's my fields with my tree rows, and again, because of the tree rows, I catch all the snow basically from the Canadian border on and down. So when it's melting off of mine, you get basically blue, sky blue water in there. But you can see, I don't know if you can see it really well here, the water coming out of my field versus what's trying to flow down out of that field won't even mix. The solids won't mix with the clean water. But that's what's flowing down and gives our river the Red River of the North name as well too. So here's a shot of our area up this last fall, this summer. This was sometime in about mid-June. We were into a situation this year where it just wouldn't stop raining. It rained and rained and rained, and our rains were 3 and 4 inch shots at a time. So we were, in 3.5 months' time, we had 35 inches of rain. For an area that had in the last 11 years hadn't even had 35 inches of moisture combined with snowfall, melt, and rainfall in 11 years, we got that in 3.5 months. Pretty hard to do anything with that kind of rainfall that often on land that flat. And unfortunately, my land, I've got a tremendous amount of infrastructure that goes through it with natural gas pipelines, oil pipelines, fiber optic cables, and rural water. So in order to drain tile something like that, I'd have to have lift pump after lift pump after lift pump to get around it. So extremely expensive to do. So we have to just use surface drainage to the best of our ability and then manage those kind of water systems when those events hit. And hopefully the ditches aren't still plugged from all the blow dirt to move that water off of this property. So here's some of the soil from this spring off of a cover crop field that I had planted from last year. If you can look into that picture real easily, you can see, look at the moisture that's in those clay, on that soil particles. It's just a water sheen. And the root system is still alive. It's not drowned, it's not dying. Because there's porosity into that soil particles from everything that the cover crop has started to do for it. So it's trying to use the water, but when it gets 3 inches of water every other day, it's just saturated. And our topsoil is about 6 to 8 inches deep of black topsoil, and then after that we go into about 300 feet of the most god-awful yellow-gray sticky clay that you could go into, and then underneath that is a layer of bedrock. So impermeability is there. So it's tough to deal with. Here's some of the results of snow erosion. These were a field that was on the south side of my yard that blew into my yard from all winter. And this was a winter when we had about 80 inches of snowfall, but yet there was no cover on those fields, so it builds those really hard snow drifts in spots, and then you have open, and all winter long it keeps shearing and tearing and everything else. But if you look at the material that blew in my yard, tremendous amount of organic residue that blew off of that field and quite a bit of dirt. And I'll call it dirt because it's no longer soil at that point. It's dirt. It's a mess. So here's a soil sample from that soil that blew into my yard. Look at the numbers of phosphate, potassium, all the micronutrients that blew off that field. This was a year when phosphate was $850 a ton and potash was $700 a ton. Our natural soil phosphate levels in our fields around here are at 3 and 4 parts per million. Our potassium levels are about at 166 parts per million. But look at the phosphate. That was fall application of fertilizers that blew off that field.
It's the best of the best.
The best of the best. Yeah. Look at the organic matter that blew off that field, 4.3%. Every percent of organic matter is 27,000 gallons of holding capacity of water. You go into a drought, 1 inch of rain makes a big difference. We just blew that off the field. He lost 100,000 gallons of holding capacity, if you want to look at it that way. That was more water than I was getting to produce a crop with.
What is that area's like average organic matter?
You know, it varies. I got a slide, I think, that'll come up that'll show it. But in this area, it's about 2.8 to 3.4. Yeah, it's massive. So when we go north about 6, 7, 8 miles, then we start getting the 4.5s up to 5.5s. If we go east, we go down to 1% organic matter, because we'll go east 10 miles and we start climbing out of the Lake Agassiz Beach Ridge, and you'll drop down to those kind of levels. But I'll show you a slide further up what our organic matters used to be as a tall grass prairie. So here's an area of one of my fields that used to be a barn lot where livestock used to be. And you can see the difference in our potassium and phosphate levels from having livestock in those areas. Nitrogen's not real high. You know, the crop used it up. Even sampling deep down to 4 feet, they use it up. But look at our available nutrients that are in there from livestock and having them in there. And that hasn't had livestock in it for almost 40 years, but those levels stay. You know, they're not transient. You're going to hold them. You're going to be able to use them. Makes a big difference. And then the other one is outside of the barn lot. Look at the difference there, where our phosphate levels are a third of where outside that area. Our organic matters, look at the organic matter, 4.2 versus 5.9. Our pHs aren't real different though. They're very similar. But look, this is what it's amazing to me is when we've got these kind of levels, look at the recommendations. Let's just pour some more on again. Why would we do that? You know, it makes no sense. And when we do total nutrient digests on something like that, that's up into the thousands of pounds of phosphate that are there. But if we don't have the biology there to establish to use it, it's just there. It's tied up.
When we ship in phosphate from somewhere else, it comes out of Russia or Canada or wherever, it's just rock.
It's just rock.
Ground into a granular form and shipped it down here on a rail, and they say, here, I'll sell this to you, spread it on your field. It's the same rock that's out there in your field.
Yep.
Just put more on. Become a moron farmer.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
You need some because obviously you don't have it available. So let's put some more on that's not available.
Yep. Exactly. And pH has a big deal to do with that.
Yeah.
So out of
The
curiosity,
biological factor of the soil, how active biologically is it?
that's what does it. Yep. Absolutely. So out of curiosity last winter, and I do a tremendous amount of soil testing, and I'm always asking the question why and what. So I'm a 60-year-old, 2-year-old in that respect. I always want to know why and what. I want those questions answered. So on my own, I went down. The river is 2 miles south of my yard. So here's the river, the flowing river. Here's the road. I went halfway in between and took a soil sample out of there. So I wanted to know what basically native natural prairie river bottomland was like. And the one on the far left is a natural prairie where it was tall grass prairie. Trees were trees were transplanted out of the river bottom to establish a farmstead to protect livestock operation at that time out of my grandfather's land. So we start looking at these numbers. That has never been touched. Fertility, nothing, has never been touched. This is water that flows and floods and everything else through the eons. But look at our levels that are in these pieces of property. So we've farmed these lands now, and after all these years of pouring on fertilizer and everything else like that, our natural levels that we started out with are higher than anything that we can apply to these fields. But look at when you get down into the organic matters. You were asking that question of where we were at. Our tall grass prairies and the river bottoms lands were at 13.2% organic matter. In the open prairie, up on the land, 9.2% organic matter. This field, on the south side of this field, is down to 2.9. We've burnt that organic matter out of that soil. We've burnt and lost that carbon source. We've lost that energy source. It becomes a holding medium is all it's doing. And that's why we got to keep applying more and more and more and more nutrients to try get these crops to grow. But if we don't reestablish the bacteria and the biologies in these soils, it's going to become even worse. And we'll burn these organic matters out even harder because we're selecting 4 species of bacteria. They're nitrogen-loving bacteria. That's all they want is nitrogen. And when they can't get the nitrogen, they attack the organic matter and burn it out to satisfy their needs because we don't have the protozoas in there to eat them and digest them and release them back to the crop. So we just keep pouring more nitrogen on. So it's a very vicious cycle. So here's some cover cropping practices. So here's some of the stuff that I've done to help rebuild some of my soils up there. And this was 3 years ago. We had a prevent to plant event. We had 2 weekends where we had 6.5 inches of rain back to back 2 weekends in a row. We had just gone through a winter where we had 68 inches of snow. I had a beautiful blanket of snow that was 3 feet deep. It melted off. We looked like it was going to be perfect. And all of a sudden the weather came in. And you just can't do anything with that. So the field sealed like a Tupperware lid. And so we had to go out. I had to break the crust. Once I broke the crust, the field was able to dry. The life was able to start taking off and growing. So I seeded a cover crop in about the 28th of June. It's a 13 species blend spaced on 7.5 inch spacing. From the day I seeded it to the day of emergence was 3 days. It came that fast. This is a picture within 2 weeks. This was a month later, and then come September, this was over the height of the tractor cab. It grew that fast in that species blend. After that rain that hit in early May, that's when the rain shut off. We never got an inch of rain the rest of the whole growing season at all until it came into the fall. And then we finally got some snow again. That cover crop was able, because of the various architecture in it, and I can show you in another slide here, because of the architecture, it gained a tremendous amount of moisture, because that was a year we had dew, but we also had a tremendous amount of smoke. But the dew, the various architecture of those plants, caught that moisture in form of dew and brought it down the plant and stored it in the soil moisture. My regular monocrop fields that were barley and beans were burnt up. They were dry, they were hard, they were miserable to try a soil sample. These you could take a soil penetrometer and just sink it in 3 feet, not an effort at all. The commodity crop fields were hard as a rock. There was no moisture there for them. So here's what some of that looked like when I was shredding it. I had an Alloway 22-foot wide shredder and shredding it. Like I said, it was over top the cab. The other option was to chemically spray it off, and I didn't like that option because something that's that big, that mature, chemistry doesn't work very good on anyhow. So I went the mechanical method, ground that up. In there was a tremendous amount of brown ribs sweet sorghum, very high sugar contents. This grew so thick the deer couldn't get in there to walking around. They stayed on the outside edges. But I started getting all kinds of birds that aren't in our area that were coming in. You know, that was really interesting to see the birds, the different birds that were in there. And then after that was gone, those birds were gone until I brought another cover crop again, and they migrated back in. Those kind of habitats bring those different types of birds in. This field was, I shredded it in September. It all started regrowing again until we got to about the 12th of October, and we had a morning that was down to 9 degrees, and it finally frost killed it. Those turnips and radishes froze off on the top. They turned to mush. The mush absorbed right into the soil surface, and they released all their nutrients and everything into the ground. So it was a perfect recycling and pulling up of deep lost nutrients up to the surface. This field soil tested out at 87 pounds of nitrogen that was recaptured that would have been lost. Phosphate levels were elevated as well in there as well. So here's just some pictures of this fall. This was a lot of barley in this blend, but we had already taken a frost, so the sorghum got hurt and got hit early, so it started breaking down. The barley came strong, the buckwheat and everything else came strong, but it's breaking down and releasing the nutrients back into the ground to feed the biology in the ground. So some of the soil tests you saw last night, if you went over to the booth, where some of my soil samples were out of here, and the structure and everything else. Greatly enhanced. Here's some of the radishes that came off those fields. And look how they're so distorted. Those are from compaction layers, where that plant, as it was growing, had to wiggle around and move it through, but it was still trying to break. But look at the layers difference. These are 22 inches long. 11 inches of it was in the ground. The other 11 inches got pushed up out of the ground. But with these turnips and radishes and the cover crop, I've changed my weed species that have been out there. By going into no-till systems, you get a change of weed species, and dandelions is one of them that really start to come in. Dandelions love compaction, they like high nitrogen on the surface, and they are there to also to liberate calcium. By putting these in, I choke them out for one thing, but I'd take out the compaction, I drop the soluble salt levels, I drop my nitrogen levels, and now those dandelions go away. Weeds will tell you a lot what's going on in your fields. And not necessarily a weed is bad either, because if you get into a prevent a plant and it stays really wet, those weeds will harvest and take up a tremendous amount of nitrogen that would either be leached, washed, or moved away. So they're a reservoir to pull that back up and hold it. We manage them so they don't go to seed, or we can put livestock in them to graze them. Lamb's quarter is fantastic livestock food, very high in energy, very digestible. So a weed isn't a weed always necessarily. It's just a plant that's out of its place. So here's some of the earthworms that have started to move back into our soils over there. Our land being so heavily intensively farmed, heavy chemistry, heavy tillage, basically devoid of any worms. This worm is 10 inches long. So these are the giant night crawlers that have started to move in instead of just the little worms that try to survive. Now I'm starting to get multi-species worms that are starting to even move in to further help my underground tillage so that I don't have to do the tillage. Let the microbes and the arthropods and everything else do your tillage work for you. So guys always complain about slugs issues and stuff like that. So this is a product they found that helps control slugs. It's just an iron oxide. So it's not toxic to anything else besides slugs. And if your land is suffering from iron chlorosis issues, you're not putting on that much. You probably won't even see a difference in your soybeans, but it's just iron base. And it lacerates and kills the slugs. That's how it controls. So out of that cover crop field, here's some of the root structure that you saw. Look at the microfine hair roots that have explored everything. So this is actually a soil clod that was on the surface on that field. Not only do the roots go down, but the roots in these covers went and explored up and above as well too. So they went into anything to go find nutrients and life to live on, moisture, oxygen, mineral nutrients, whatever. They explored it and they shattered those big compacted clods in pedons, so it liberates and frees up your soil. That was amazing to me to see that, because I had never seen that before in our soils. That wasn't evident before. So here's that field that I shredded. That was 8 feet tall. This was the residue the next spring that I no-tilled planted wheat into. And I plant on 15-inch centers, not 7.5s. So I seed winter wheat instead of spring wheats or winter rye, because they tiller. Our spring varieties don't tiller. So that's another reason why we plant them in narrow rows. In Canada, their varieties tiller, extensive tillering. We want 5-6 tillers. So I can get by on planting, 2/3 of what a spring wheat crop seeding rate would be. So that helps on control of cost. Fertility is lower. Weed control is lower because it smothers things up before they get going. But in that picture, Lance was talking about it a little bit this morning, the saprophytic fungi. Well, with the heavy, high content of sweet sorghum, high sugar, the saprophytic fungi moved in. So now they're breaking that down so that the bacteria can break it down, so I can get a full cycle of change of decomposition for my nitrogen and phosphate cycle to start taking over. So now I'm not applying nitrogens and I'm not applying phosphates again. It's starting to cycle. That was really interesting to see, because where that was at in that wheat field was where I had a high level of volunteer buckwheat that came in after that cover crop. In the part of the field where the buckwheat didn't regerminate, I didn't have the saprophytic fungi. So they play hand in hand. There's a synergy in your difference in your plants, in your residues. So here's just some suppression chart of horseweed by using different cover crops and the difference in suppressions versus chemistries. So we can use different cover crops to suppress weeds versus always turning to the jug to try to kill everything. So here's the wheat that's emerging through, and you can see I got some volunteers that are coming through of the previous year's cover crop, and that was easily taken care of because I was able just to go to one type of chemistry. Then I didn't have to buy a multi-pack chemistry to take care of it because I didn't have the broadleaves, I didn't have the resistance. So then I was able to just hone in on one species that I had to remove out of that field. There again, making it more environmentally friendly again. Here's what those 15-inch rows look like. But down inside, here's that volunteer buckwheat that came through. So it's basically a form of intercropping almost, growing 2 crops in one. Buckwheat is a fantastic plant for freeing up and releasing phosphate that's tied up in the soil. So the crop got a shot of phosphate. They act synergistically off of each other. And buckwheat doesn't take very much moisture to grow. You can germinate that off of a dew. When that seed is sitting on top of the surface, so when guys are looking at top seeding into growing corn, instead of just rye, look at putting buckwheat in there because it takes very little moisture for that to get growing. And now you're starting to free up your phosphates into your soils again.
Does the buckwheat ever interfere with harvest if you were going to take it straight?
I did cut that straight.
But you cut it high.
I had to cut it very high. In North Dakota, that's restricted. You can't have buckwheat in your wheat. Minnesota, it's frowned on, but so they'll take it as dockage.
Okay.
If the level was high enough, I would have just cleaned it out and kept it as well as again. Yeah.
Just run it through a screener.
Just run through a screener real fast, knock it out.
So by the time you harvest the wheat, there's seed on the buckwheat then?
Yep. Yep. The very top flowers. The bottoms aren't yet, but the very, very top. And they're viable. Buckwheat's viable in 68 days. From emergence to viability, it's 68 days.
It's never aggressive enough that it affects your crop that's out there
No.
because it's shaded too
It's shaded too much. This came late. This was last spring when we planted and we didn't get any rain for almost 7 weeks. So the buckwheat didn't come until we got into late June, first part of July. And by that time our chemistries are out of use anyhow. So then you have to wait for pre-harvest Roundup, and I don't use pre-harvest Roundup. So here's just a cover that are inside of some soybeans that I planted, just to help keep anything from crusting and wind erosion. And heat is the shade, because these fields we get very hot, and then the heat coming off those fields, you've seen soil temperatures where they go up to 140, 150 degrees, bakes these little soybeans. So if I can keep a growing cover there of a small grain crop, it helps shade and cool that ground. Evaporation rates change, everything changes. And at that stage, it doesn't compete that hard with soybeans. The evaporation loss is more than the competition from that cover protecting those beans. Here's some what we did in some sugar beets, where we seeded twin rows of winter wheat or winter rye, and then we seed the sugar beets some of them are in between and some of them are on the outside edges, again to stop that effect on the sugar beets of helicoptering and wind shearing and everything else, just to protect those little sugar beets. Here's an example of where they are starting to use wheat intercropping in with brassicas, and they're using that as a means of breaking up insect patterns, because the brassicas will get hit with flea beetles early. So if we put a barrier crop inside of that, we can help reduce the population damage from flea beetles. Again, lessening our chance of having to use insecticides. Here's some intercropping pictures where it's flax every other row and then canola put in between it. And that's up in Saskatchewan, where they're doing those kind of practices. Again, 15-inch rows, alternating your seedings. And then that's all combined at one time with the stripper header. And then it's taken back and it's separated in a seed cleaning plant. That farm uses no chemistry at all. No fertilizer, no chemistry. Everything is but they do use compost teas and very little micronutrient applications. Yeah. And they're a very large farm. So this was down in South Dakota about 3 weeks ago. This was a wheat field. The farmer decided he didn't like just having wheat stubble, so he interseeded oats into it, put a cover of oats into it, and then strip tilled it for corn production. So when people say you can't get through tall residue strip till and you got to take it, work it, and then come back, and if you want to strip it and place fertilizer, it's however you set that strip till machine up. It can handle residue. Those are 30-inch spacings. So here was an interesting where I involuntarily double cropped. So this was a soybean field that was a oats field the previous year. It was foundation oats that I raised and had for certified seed. The beans came up. It was a very dry year. And late in July, all of a sudden the oats came. We had a shot of rain. We had a half-inch of rain. The oats, being that this was no-tilled, that seed was still sitting on the surface. That blew out the back end of the combine. The oats came. We were beyond any kind of legal limits on chemical applications. So I just said, let the oats come. Can't hurt us that bad, and it didn't. The beauty of it actually was harvesting ease. That oats matured out. It actually helped shatter loss off the headers. It came in, flowed just beautiful through the combine. These beans look like I waxed them. So they brought a really nice grade on the beans. I took them to a seed plant, cleaned the oats, cleaned the splits, sold the beans, sold the oats as feed, doubled my income on an inadvertent mistake, so to speak. That's why we got to look at doing polycropping instead of monocropping. And the biggest fight is federal crop, is to get those.
Winter rye, just as an experiment, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Let the winter rye go. Didn't apply any herbicide that year at all. Beans were out there. Combined it all together. first load I went to the elevator with was 17% foreign matter. And went heavy. So I screened the rest, you know, and the beans were beautiful then. I think they averaged about 30 bushel acre beans.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had winter rye seed, cover crop seed for the next 3 years.
Yeah, yeah. And then what was interesting is this oats came out at 43 pounds.
Yeah.
Very heavy oats, a third more weight. So, and the oats ran about 12 bushel the acre.
And no fungicide applied to get that.
None,
Yeah.
none. No additional fertility, no nothing. So,
So how does double cropping work with the crop insurance? Because I'm hearing from farmers they have to grow when and what and why.
yep, that's the whole fight, is fighting federal crop on this. And the only reason why it's being fought is they don't want to rewrite their actuarial tables.
So they can see
The benefits are there.
of it, but they're too lazy to progress.
Yep. Nobody's making them do it. Maybe this next administration will.
Big claim.
You have to remember that the people that write the regs for crop insurance aren't the farmers.
No. Practicality.
You know, so they aren't engaged in this stuff.
No.
So to convince them is a whole step
Mm-hmm.
in itself.
So when I raise this also for some of the double crop stuff like that, I look at bringing it into food processing plants for pet food, livestock food, and everything else. And I said, well, why don't you take it this way? You can still run your tests on, give me a grade out, and we sell it on a TDN value or whatever. There's a system that you can grade it out at. No, we got to separate it out, then we'll grind it and we'll put it back together. So it's extra handling, extra expense, and this way it's already done for you.
This last spring I tried field peas with my oats. My background was dairy farming. We did that all the time as a forage,
Yeah.
but never as a grain. And now I got a bunch of buddies that are hog farmers that are like, well, we can grow oats, get paid from the government to grow the oats, and we can add peas in for our hog feed. We're already
Yeah,
one
because
less
they're
in
not
the
marked.
mix. Yeah.
They're
Mm-hmm.
marked through us.
Yeah. So up in Ontario, Canada, around Guelph, they started running studies for livestock for dairy rations. So they're raising a 90-day corn, and then they put in a 2.0 maturity soybean, or basically at that time it becomes a forage soybean for them. They raise them side by side, seeded at the same time. The benefit of that is the soybean produces a tremendous amount of protein for them in that ration, so they go and chop it off, so they've got a very high rich dairy ration that they're chopping off. Well, the forage soybeans don't like to be chopped very well, so there's still quite a bit of plant that are out there. So then they turn their dry cows out there to graze on it in the wintertime. And so they're getting a high protein value for flushing those cows before they breed them back. So they're getting a win-win situation in an excellent feed source versus having to start feeding hay extra early as well too. So when they say we can't do these things, we're doing it up in extreme parts of Canada, we can do them here.
Is that Axton's that you were at with the
The intercropping?
poly or intercropping?
Yeah, Dwayne Axton. Yeah. Yeah, so now also is weed control management in these situations. So here's one company called ReadyCop, and they came out with a fine chopper that are just about on all combines. But they built a weed macerator that comes off of the final sieves of the combine. And in their macerator system, it's a unit of fixed pins. And inside that, air is blowing at a high speed, and it knocks the seed against the pins, destroying the germ, cracks the seed, and it breaks the germ of the weed seed. Right now they're getting 98% control on weed seeds. So if we can stop the weed seeds from just being blown back on the field, then we can stop and reduce again our chemical inputs to control those weeds, and we start controlling resistant weeds as well too. They're not cheap systems, but weeds are not cheap systems either, control of all the chemistries.
What weeds does that work on?
Any of the small grass weeds, like your foxtails and your millets, and then you get into the wild oats, and then your your broad seeded leaves, your kochias and your pigweeds and your lamb's quarters and the Palmer amaranths and all of those. So North Dakota State University is doing testing on them to test them so that they fit their testimonial, see if they truly are what they are, and they are. Yeah,
They're like 50 or 60 grand, aren't they? Higher yet?
double.
Yeah, they've used them in Australia and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked into them and it's like, oh.
Yep. So like on your John Deere combines, your X9s, and then in the 9250 cases, some of them now, those are standard equipment on those combines as well too. So,
Yeah, keep in mind though that it's only treating the seeds that come out the back end of the combine. You're still gonna
Yep.
have some weeds out there.
you will have some, but at least you greatly reduce them.
Absolutely.
Yep. And then it also helps for volunteers. So if you're a seed producer, a wheat seed producer, it'll also take care of those lightweight seeds, scabby kernels, that'll decimate those as well too. So it helps for your rotation for seed producers. So here's just some different planting equipment setups to handle the higher residues. This is one of the drills I had, and then I switched into the air seeder. Down pressures were an issue. Floatability was another big thing. The compaction, this machine was too heavy. The toolbar itself was very heavy. The design of the carrying wheels was wrong for heavy clay soils. It pushes instead of, the wheels should have actually been turned around backwards. So in these situations, it didn't fit my situation for what I wanted to do, so that's why I went to a single disc drill. It was not still the drill I wanted, but that's what we have in the United States. If I had my choice, the seeding equipment would come from Europe. The cross slot is one. That's a very good drill, high horsepower requirement, but the technology behind it's great.
Great overview. Could you repeat the questions for the recording?
Yeah, so they asked, as far as the seeding equipment goes, is the cross slot one of the options that we could look at? And they are. And there was a manufacturer that was manufacturing in Wisconsin as well too. The designs that they're using over in Europe, they're planting on very high, thick cover crops because they're reclaiming ocean floor and they're very high in rock material and stuff like that. So they grow a high clay into these, so they grow a heavy cover crop to reclaim those clay soils. So they had to change the design of how they use the seed openers. So the disc is actually turned at a slot, so it's almost like performing laparoscopic eye surgery. We just want to lift the flap, blow the seed underneath, and then let the flap down and close it back up. In the United States, everything is vertical, and it's got a pitch to it, which is a catch point for when you're trying to seed into high residue materials. And then you're pulling, and you're grabbing, and you're tearing, and you're plugging your machine, you're fighting it. The other thing you're doing is you're moving that soil too much now, and you're pitching it. So if you're on a grade, now you've made a wash zone where the water can tear into it, even if you're no-tilling. So here's an option on these no-till drills. Like this is a seed boot off of a John Deere bit drill. So we were able to drill these shoes, put a liquid fertilizer tube in so we can put starter fertilizers or our brewing teas, our fungals. So we can put fertilizer down, pinpoint that placement. So the seed drills we can set up to be just like our double disc planting where we're putting things in furrow. We can do that with the grain drills as well. So we're not limited to just dry fertilizer. We can accurately place dry starter fertilizers where they need to be or other biological agents in with that seed. Again, we're enhancing our fertilizer efficiency by placement. We don't have to put out massive gallons. We don't have to put out massive tons of dry fertilizer because of placement. Here's some different tillage systems. This is for blowing down and putting like a cover crop on corn stalks. We've seen this in some areas. Here's just another example of it over here. Here's a fertilizing system, these spoke wheel systems. They use them quite extensively in Kansas and then out in the Palouse wheat growing region. The other ones are a interseeding for seeding cover crop into standing corn when you're side dressing corn, putting in a cover into the corn. Very simple systems. Again, harvesting methods. The stripper header is a fantastic piece of equipment. Now we can just take the heads off. We don't have all that residue to have to fight. So if we're strip tilling wheat, all we've got is just the chaff. Chaff breaks down real rapidly. It's not having to mess with all the chopped up straw, so we don't have to bale straw off. We're not harrowing fields. It just makes it a lot easier. The stripper header is extremely efficient for the combines. We don't need to have a massive combine because we're not handling all that throughput of straw to get off of a field. They're extremely efficient for fuel use consumption. I hired a neighbor to do mine. He did 200 acres of wheat for me. He used a quarter tank of fuel. Under a conventional system, he would have burnt a full tank of fuel plus. So the savings was there too. Instead of combining at 3 miles an hour, he was moving along at 7.5 miles an hour. So if you're using custom harvesting units, they want to get across acres in a hurry. That's how you get across acres in a hurry. Here they're interseeding into soybeans, ripening soybeans to get a cover going early so that we can protect these fields early in the fall.
How wide are those stripper heads available at?
42 feet. You can get them about 42 feet wide. I think the narrowest is 20 feet. But we're able to use the stripper heads in canola fields, hemp. They're harvesting hemp with it. Flax, oats, all the small grains. They've got a very extensive use on them. The only thing they really don't like to use on them is the edible beans and soybeans. They don't handle the pods real well.
Soybeans, you have to get all close down to the ground there to get
Yeah, they shatter too bad. Yeah.
hitting dirt into that header.
Yep. Therefore, they'd be a pretty high wear. Here's just some examples of some shop-built home interseeders where guys took toolbars that were laying out in the back trees, stretched them, threw some coulters on them, and set them up for interseeding. Very little cost. So this morning we had Lance talking about his lab and his Regen Ag lab. So I used the Haney, the PLFLA, and the Total Nutrient Digest samples. So 3 years ago when I started doing that, my fields came back up on a PFLA test, basically showed there was nothing. These soils were depleted, they were dead, there was nothing there. And then that's when I started integrating in the different cover crops, dropped out the tillage entirely so there was no till, and then started retesting again. And in 3 years' time, my new tests that were showing very poor to dead are now showing excellent to very positive results in a very short period of time, 3 years' time. But moisture makes a big difference as well too. We went through 11 years of drought, so everything was dormant, dead, or gone. And now with 30-some inches of moisture, recharge that soil profile again, those species move back in as well too. But you gotta give them a home as well too. So there's just a plant ecology succession slide. Our management skills that we apply to our land will change our fungal to bacterial ratios. Our fungicides that we put on kill our funguses that we want to do, but it'll kill off our beneficial our funguses that are controlling our detrimental bacterias. We put a fungicide on, then we get a bacterial flush. And then when we go into using glyphosate and some of those other ones, it's been proven we've had issues with glyphosate because glyphosate is one of the strongest chelators known to man. So we tie up micronutrients extremely fast, and then those are transferred into us. And then we start having micronutrient deficiencies inside our body. One of the number one micronutrient deficiencies around the world is zinc. So that's why we need, and when you find most of our soil tests are very limited on zinc in most fields.
Zinc is one of the most important microbes for
Absolutely. If you get a cold, zinc tablets will help straighten that out extremely fast. So here's a couple of the books that I like especially for weeds, to understand what's going on with weeds. Weeds, what they tell us. Weeds, the guardians of our soil. And weeds, control without poisons. And again, cropping pressures, multi-species pressure of different interseeding, everything makes a difference on weed control. When we start changing our soil biome from our extracts that we're putting down, and we start taking away excess nitrogen, it affects the germination on these weeds as well too. So that's how you can control those. So here's some of the tools that I use and monitor what my fields are, and my spray solutions as well too. Just a simple pH meter. Majority of our weed resistance problems come from water not being the correct pH for those compounds to work properly. Most herbicides want to be in a pH range of 5 to 5.5. If we're using 8 pH water, we've already nullified a lot of the effect of those chemistries. Generally, when we have high pH water like that, we also have a high level of iron, calcium, and magnesium. So we need to treat those before we go in and start putting our chemistries in. Sequester the calcium and magnesium and iron out of it, then control the pH, and then your chemistries will work much better again. Brix meters. I can tell the health of my plant is with a Brix meter. If I need to do something to that plant by using if my Brix levels are low, and lows are generally in the 6s and 8s, soybeans want to be in 12, 13, 14s. The higher our Brix levels, the healthier the plant is, the less susceptible we are to aphid infections and invasions from aphids. And this other one that looks like a football is a meter that goes in the very top of it, measures CO2. So I can put this in a field and I can measure the CO2 release as a CO2 burst test that they can run like at Regen Ag Labs. This will monitor to me. Those bands will tell me what the soil moisture is. It collects rainfall data. It gives me barometric pressures. It gives me all kinds. It's a small weather station. The product was developed for putting in potato harvesting equipment. So they would check bruise free on potatoes as it was going through a harvester, go up into a potato warehouse bin, and then monitor the potatoes in the bin if they were having hot spots, if their CO2 levels were going up, if there was anything else, they could tell what was going on in a potato bin. Now they use them for sugar beets as well too. And now they're putting them in dairy barns and hog barns to monitor methane levels that are in the barns as well. These things cost about $500 is all. And the information is incredible that they give you, and it's downloaded to your phone. So you can download that and get the information you can change the time, but every 2 hours or less. And then if you're working with a research group, they can download that information as well if you're doing a field trial for them as well too. They're indestructible too. You can drive over top them with a truck. If you do crush them, the company's been fantastic. They'll just send you a replacement. You pay a subscription fee on them to use them, but you own them, but you pay a subscription fee.
Go back to your pH meter there and structured water so that you're not or you are chelating the elements in the water itself so that your chemical can be functional. That's exactly how glyphosate works in the soil to chelate your nutrients that are necessary for the plants, and it ties them up.
And that's what kills them weeds. Yep.
Very strong chelator.
Very strong chelator. Yep. Yep. So there's simple tools. The pH meter is $35. The Brix meter, you can get them anywhere from $25 to $55. The Brix meter is amazing, simple, cheap little tool to use. Go into a grocery store, go crush your grapes, and look at those from the organic counter to the conventional counter. Go look at them. You might be surprised on how they rate out and which ones you end up buying. Because when you start buying food on a nutrient level, not what a label says, there's a big difference.
So that's the middle,
Yeah, the Brix meter is the blue one.
and that measures more than pH?
No, that'll measure the Brix level, which is basically the sugar level of a plant. The higher the sugar level is an indication of higher nutrient level that's in that plant, and the healthier the plant is, the higher the Brix level. Winemakers use them, and breweries use them a lot as well too. They want to see what the sugar contents are when they're fermenting wine.
The canning companies, they always use them to test like sweet corn or field peas, or the peas for canning, because they want to try and hit that optimal level of sugar content. You know? And so that's how they know when the field is ready for harvest, or prime for harvest, or beyond prime for harvest.
So we're actually looking at them also now for the use of sweet sorghum for chopping stage, for making ethanol out of it as well too. So we know exactly when we need to chop that for the optimum level of alcohol production in ethanol plants. So here's just a couple of the books that I really find that were really interesting. Is Will Harris, a regenerative beef farmer, and that's a very interesting book to read. His YouTube videos are really interesting to watch. And then Nicole Masters, she's from the New Zealand, Australia area, soil microbiologist, and she has a university training course now as well too, to train consultants in the regenerative processes. And she works, some of her training also is along with Dr. Elaine Ingham from the Soil Food Web. So they train you how to use and understand what you're looking at through a microscope and stuff. But these were my soils. These clay soils of mine would swell and shrink, and in drought years, I had cracks in my fields that were as wide as my fist and over 7 feet deep. Takes a tremendous amount of water to close those back up. But now, under a regenerative system, my cracks are now considered micro cracks. They're 1/4 to 1/2 inch wide, not 4 inches, 5 inches wide. If you look down inside, you can see all the roots are just sheared and tore apart as well too. And that is it. Any questions?